Hello, my name is Johnny Jetzer, and I'm a curator at large at the Harshon Museum and Sculpture Garden, currently calling from Switzerland, where it's 1 a.m. Thank you for joining me and Rachel Rose in discussion tonight as part of the museum's weekly Artist Talk series, Talking to Our Time. Welcome, Rachel.
Hello.
What a pleasure to do the talk with you. If I understood right, you are in New York City.
Yes.
And you just have become mother for the second time. So you probably won't get too much sleep, I assume.
Yes.
I remember when I was a father, actually, that it felt almost like being a different person, because it changes so much your personality if your sleeping pattern is not the one that you used to, but it's just arbitrary how you just take what comes your way.
Yeah, totally.
So I think it's really a privilege and a chance to have you with us and to speak about your work. I want to do a short introduction. We have selected 3 films afterwards with short excerpts, and we will speak about the films. And I think all the films that I've seen are multi-layered, are complex, are full of references, and are quite ambivalent. And so it's really interesting to have the opportunity to ask you questions and to try to decipher certain streams of consciousness that show up in these films. As viewers, of course, you're going to have the chance to ask your questions. You have a Q&A button on the top, and feel free to ask your questions for Rachel that we will answer around that is 7:45, 7:45. So just a short introduction. Rachel Rose has made a name for herself with video installations, combining images and sounds in innovative ways. Her pieces aim to convey sensorial aspects of ideas by manipulating sound and image. Her imagery depicts, as Moose magazine once wrote, humanity's short current anxieties and their multi-layered interconnectivity, as well as humanity's relationship to the natural world, advancing technology, mortality, and history. Rachel has started her education by earning a BA in Humanities and a BA Art from Yale University, as well as later an MFA from Columbia University. And it's interesting to know that she entered graduate school as a painter, and she exited it as a film director. And she also studied with Brigitte Tiravanit, the artist who was a strong influence on relational aesthetics and who's still teaching at Columbia. Rose has had solo exhibits at the Serpentine Gallery, the Whitney Museum of Art. She had presented solo exhibits at Fondazione Sandretto Rerebadengo in Turin in 2018, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2018, Kunsthaus Bregenz in Austria in 2017, Museo Serralves in Porto, Portugal in 2016, the Aspen Art Museum in 2016, the Whitney Museum of American Art in 2015, and the Serpentine Sackler Gallery in 2015. The recent project, and we're going to speak about Enclosure from 2019, was jointly commissioned by the Park Avenue Armory in New York and Luma Foundation in Arles. Will-O-Wisp was jointly commissioned and owned by the Philadelphia Museum of Art and Fondazione Sandretto Rerebadengo. Everything and More from 2015 was presented at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York during the biennial, and Palisades from 2015 at the Serpentine Sackler Gallery in London in 2014. Rose's work has been featured in the 2018 Carnegie International, the 2017 Venice Biennale, the 2016 Sao Paulo Biennale, and numerous other group exhibitions. So we will speak mainly about 3 works tonight: A Minute Ago from 2014, which features found video footage of Philip Johnson conducting a tour of his glass house, and the 2014 hailstorm in Novosibirsk, Siberia. The second work is Lake Valley from 2016 that debuted at Pilar Correa's gallery in London and was a collaboration with a cell animator. She utilized images from 19th century illustrations that you had archived. And each frame is a composite of elements from 19th to 20th century children's books illustrations cut, layered, and remapped for the present day. And lastly, Enclosure 2019 is a high story about survival in the 17th century agrarian English landscape, a period of radical economic, environmental, and social transformation that left it disfranchised in a state of uncertainty, susceptible to both fear and theft. I'm really excited to have these three works as kind of a spine of our discussion tonight. And I just want to ask you like a first question. I mean, our world has changed a lot in these past 10 months, and especially exposure to culture has been very limited, maybe with the exception of film. And I want to ask you if you watched a film lately that really stuck in your mind and that left a lasting impression.
Well, I've seen a few things just this week that come to mind. Last night I was watching this Japanese film called The Black Cat, which is a Japanese ghost story that's from the early 70s. That was stunning. But I think one of the things I've loved that's been made during COVID maybe is Malcolm and Marie. I don't know have you had a chance to see this?
Nope.
This Levinson film with Zendaya and John David Washington. And it was written in a week during COVID, shot, I think in May during COVID, and then released during COVID on Netflix. And it's two actors in a house having a fight. It reminds me of My Dinner with Andre, Louis Malle film. But I think it's pretty powerful work in that it shows how much can be done in storytelling through a conversation. So I loved the economy of it.
That sounds very interesting. I'm gonna have to watch that.
It's just a fight between in a relationship. That's the film. The way that My Dinner with Andre is just, two people having dinner.
So I think we should dive into the first work. And I mean, I know the work since a long time because I was on a jury at Artissima in Turin, I think in 2014. And a minute ago was the winner of the special prize of the jury. And I really remember the way I digested basically those imagery, and I was really impressed how much it is a construction with an intellectual framework, but also a punch in the guts, because it touches so much also the viewer on the emotional level, and I think the great entrance scene where you have this hailstorm combined with a Pink Floyd, I think, concert recording is really like something incredible. It has almost like the drama of an opera setting, or also a very strong apocalyptic scenery. Can you tell a little bit more about like how you came to find this appropriate imagery, and how you started to choose it as an entrance scene?
Yeah, two different paths to working with that as a score and finding this footage. How do I get to it? So one of the things that I was exploring in this work is collage and the relationship between collage and catastrophe, because catastrophic experiences can feel so much like they've been cut and pasted into our reality. And like all the transitional space that gradates us or attunes us to something happening is destroyed in a catastrophic moment. And in a way, COVID felt like that. I mean, I think many of us remember, I think it was March 12th. I remember I went to my studio in the morning, and in the afternoon, everything was different. And so I was looking at the history of basically collage and film, in editing, but also in composing within the frame. And that takes you to the history of special effects and that in film. And so in a minute ago later, after this opening sequence, there's all kinds of composites within the frame that I created, like a storm, or that are artificial. And as a counter to that, I was interested in how I could find a piece of footage that was real, but charted and felt artificial or staged. It felt like it was live footage of what we often experience, at least visually, as constructed. And so that's how I came to this footage. I was looking for a long time, and then a friend sent me this. And the Pink Floyd piece, I guess, comes in later with the way that I was thinking about ruins in relationship to catastrophe. And they performed what you hear in Pompeii, obviously the site of a massive catastrophic ruin. And they're playing a song essentially to the dead in this empty stadium. I have some of the footage later. And so I just warped it a little bit and slowed it down and set it to this.
Do you create something like a mind map, where you start to weave or like to assemble like all these different elements? I mean, obviously, one of the dominant elements in a minute ago is the ruin that is materialized in different ways. And I mean, I would say, and maybe we should watch soon, like the excerpt to see the second scene, which is quite a hard cut between this entrance scene of the hailstorm with the Pink Floyd music, and then all of a sudden this world famous architecture, the glass pavilion of Philip Johnson in the woods. And you have like this serene, especially in the beginning, in the first scene, you have this very serene depiction of architecture, of modernist architecture and nature. So maybe we should just, yes, sorry.
No, I don't have anything. Yeah. I wasn't sure if you were asking something.
So let's watch this scene that is rather at the beginning.
Architecture is mostly a question of procession. In other words, you've got to enter a group of buildings through a gateway, which we now have. And as you come in, you explore the whole terrace here.
That was the glass house period when I did everything like this, and there were street lines like this. And then inside, which you'll see in a minute, we went on and loosened up.
Loaded on, they have flat roofs, they have lots of glass, and the ribbons of glass. Those are the
That was the glass house
we
period when I did
the world. It's
everything
like
like
American
this.
now.
You enter into what I call the entrance vestibule. Then you step a few steps, imaginary wall, and as you turn, the world changes because your point of vision goes round and round. It's much like a dog sniffing his way into a room. It always goes around the outside and settles around and around and curls at last in somewhat of a middle or somewhere near the middle of the room and curls up and goes to sleep.
So it's incredible how many things happen in this very short scene. And of course, I mean, I think it's very interesting to look at the camera movement. Maybe you could tell a little bit more what your intention was in the creation of this very eerie walk around.
Yeah. So one of the things about the glass house that's so striking, and because it was really a model for the skyscraper, which seems so wild because it's so recent that the glass house was made, but is that it really functions like a mausoleum. There's no air circulation. In the summer, when I filmed that, it must have been 100 degrees inside. And everything is constantly molding over and sort of dying inside. And even this painting that is up on the screen, this Poussin painting, the Burial of Phocion, has to constantly be being restored because it molds over from how poorly the house basically manages light and air. And that piece of footage, Philip, is the last tour that Johnson gave of the house before he died. So he's old and frail as he moved to the house. And I rotoscoped him, I cut him out of the original footage. And then when I filmed there, I filmed shot for shot. I replicated the original camera angles and length of the shots from this VHS tape of him moving through the house. And so then when I put the two together, they feel sort of, I mean, not exactly like one shot, but sort of like two moments in time are moving together. And there was, I guess, an aspect of the house, this kind of ghost container that I wanted to bring out. And so that's what I was trying to do.
So Philip Johnson becomes almost a ghost himself, but also like a kind of a media gap of 30 years between the VHS tape and the high-res imagery that you shot. But like even the high-res imagery seems to be taken from a helmet camera or an almost mechanical robot-like approach, you know, that scans the room and seems to be almost numb towards like this kind of cultural icon that it is about to approach, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I was working with a Steadicam for that, and this is kind of like before the use of the drone was so popular in film, and so I think now we read it a bit maybe the way we think of drones, but when I made it, that was less a thing. So
I read that your father actually is an urbanist and your uncle is an architect. So I assume that architecture and the Philip Johnson house is probably part of your upbringing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, questions about how the built environment affects our psyche and our livelihood has been, you know, conversations that I've grown up with, and a certain kind of history. My uncle, Peter Calthorpe, was one of the people involved in something called the Congress for New Urbanism. I know that if I remember from our first meeting, because you did all this work on EAT, I don't know if you ever overlapped with Congress for New Urbanism, Buckminster Fuller. Anyway, this kind of...
It rings a bell.
Yeah. Anyway, thinking about utopia creations or how to create cities that utopic cities in a way, I guess. So yeah, it is something I've thought a lot about. And I think that when Hurricane Sandy happened and New York suddenly felt so fragile and frail in a way, which was really the beginning of making this work, was feeling that in a way we take for granted our built environments as protective or as constant or as and they're not.
I was really astonished to read in your text about the work that Johnson once said that the glass house was inspired by a burned out village where nothing was left but brick floors and chimneys.
Yeah, that's that's included in the film. I quote him saying that. Yeah, the site of ruin, and it's sort of I don't know what it means that a structure inspired by ruin then became the model for modernist architecture in New York City and then everywhere in the world. I think about also when I was doing research for this and reading a bit like Jane Jacobs and activists that were in, as skyscrapers proliferated, activists that were fighting against that in New York, in a very basic sense about how these enclosed spaces with no air circulation really ruin our bodies in a way. Like physically, people started having lung issues that they never had before. So yeah, they're sites of ruin.
If we look at the different representations within the film, like being the Philip Johnson glass house as a representation also of a late modernist spirit, maybe that is also like kind of fueled by mechanization, and that might be one of the results of this mechanization might be that there's no proper airflow, because it's almost like in a machine spirit that plans beyond like human needs or doesn't really respect human needs. And then the representation of Poussin, which, I mean, in his time, paintings were like a very important medium. You see, it was one of the rare sources of representation of reality, and a way like to bring like a different view on the world through a painted image. And then you have like this layer of the digital image that seems to disassemble in it's like almost like a pixel rain, where everything seems to, where the hail seems to destroy the pixels and the whole images seem to disassemble. Do you see parallels between these different forms of representation, or are they more independent?
Well, I mean, T.J. Clarke's Site of Death? I think that's the book, right? The book he wrote on Poussin, where he,
right.
I read it at the time, but now I haven't read it in a while. I mean, yeah, he talks about exactly that. These paintings is cinema, and the anecdotes or the mini worlds that exist within the painting linking up like the way that we think about storytelling in film now. But so I think that that's the only parallel in a way to the film in that way. But I mean, what's so odd about this painting specifically is that Johnson said he wanted it to be a model for the landscape because he had these kind of miniaturization of scale, which is not really featured in the film, but is there. And so he put it like here, and then there's the window, and then there's the landscape in front of it. He never talks about the fact that there's a body on the way to being buried, but not yet buried, right in the center at the bottom of the frame. And so I felt like the painting was such a direct expression of this kind of feeling that you get inside the house, and feeling that I think really comes inside our bodies living in this kind of architecture, which is like you're being held, you're decaying on hold or something.
If we go back to the title, I mean, it stems from a quote, like somebody, like a voice from the off says during this hailstorm, it was like the sky was clear a minute ago, and now this. It's kind of a reference to this sudden change and this uncertain state of reality to a certain extent. Is that something that you mirror in the second half, like with the the dissolution of the digital image.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Like the film itself is like gone. Yeah.
But is it a critique to a certain degree of digital representation, or wouldn't you go that far?
A critique in what way?
In the sense that it's maybe like a laterna magica, you know, and just an illusion. It's just a throw, and it can disappear as fast as it emerged.
I mean, I mean, no, it's not a critique of. I wasn't thinking about that, but one of the things I am always thinking about that in general, in the way that I install my work. I'm always trying to figure out, like, how do I suture what's being projected, like the image, into the space in a way that actually radiates something connected to the work. How do I give the image weight or take the weight away? Or what is this artificial light bulb that's projecting this artificial thing? How does that relate to natural light? So I am always thinking about that, but not specifically in that moment.
Thank you very much for these insights. And I think we should move on to Lake Valley. And maybe just a quick question. What is a cell animated video, like CEL? I've never heard that. And I thought I'm going to ask you instead of looking it up.
Yeah, that's, it's just a term in animation that's used to describe like how something is drawn cell by cell. So this Lake Valley is pretty rough. It's 12 frames per second. An old Disney film would have been 24 to 60 frames per second. And what that means is that literally someone is drawing a new drawing that many times per second. So in this, the only thing that's cell animated are the characters. So this little guy is cell animated. Everything else is done, well, basically created in Photoshop, which has layers, which mimic the way that plates worked in animation that existed before the computer. So it's a combination of plate and cell.
So it's again kind of a collage related technique of assembling elements that come from different sources. I mean, you exploited children books from the 19th and 20th century, and I think it was before you were reading probably children books, or before your first kid was born, right? It wasn't really biographic that you initiated this research into children books.
No, it wasn't. It's kind of like dumb, actually, what started me on the making of this work, which is that I got a dog, and I was thinking about my dog being alone a lot of the day while I was off doing other things. And so I started thinking about loneliness and stories about loneliness. And strangely, that's a big part of children's stories, are about being abandoned or being alone and finding oneself. And I was struck by that, and the confluence between the development of the illustrated children's book and the distribution of that, and a new stage of capitalism in which families separated, parents went off to work, kids went to separate daycare or school. And so this work started sort of curiosity about my dog's loneliness, and sort of ended with me asking questions about loneliness and capitalism and its relationship to storytelling.
But it's not the first time you use an animal as an important character in your film. I think in most of your films there are animals. and that they play important roles. Is there like a range of expression that animals have and that humans don't have? Or is it more like kind of a symbolic value that you are interested in?
Well, all I can say is that I grew up on a farm with all kinds of animals, and I was kind of alone on the farm, and I definitely anthropomorphized every animal around, and that was my sense of friendship and community for, a big part of my life. And so I think it's almost like something I can't help but work with animals the way that, you might cast people or work with people. I think it's like that.
But your main character here seems to be like an animal that you have invented. It has more like the head of a seal and the body of, it's hard to say what kind of, I mean, it's kind of a dog-like creature, but it's not really a breed that you would recognize. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not, it's kind of was a cross between a dog and a bunny sort of thing. I kind of wanted it to be a chimeric little guy.
So let's watch an excerpt from Lake Valley from 2016. The entire film is actually 8 minutes 25. So it's a very brief excerpt, but I think we get the atmosphere of the film. It's a completely different approach if you go back to a minute ago, where you on one hand you used appropriation to find images. So I think the Siberia beach hailstorm images were probably found on YouTube or a similar platform. And then, of course, you started to use it and to change it and to alter it digitally. But I mean, here, obviously, it's a huge work of creating this score, to design, like to reuse like all these children book illustrations and to create an animated story where you approach yourself much more to classical filmmaking and to the tradition of animation. What was that, a conscious step that you took, or was it like something that you started out of an inspiration and ended up with an animated film?
Oh yeah, it was totally conscious. Actually, I have a strange Hirshhorn connection to this work, which is, and I'm just remembering this right now, I was on the train back from DC because my husband Ian was in a show that you curated,
right,
at Hirshhorn, and I was working on this book actually at the time for Badlands Unlimited. I was making a children's book called The Sandy Cat, which was kind of the original form of Lake Valley. And I started making these collages for that book on the train ride back from the Hirshhorn. And then I used those as a model for how to approach this. But once I started, this was a commission by the Okayama Biennial that Liam Gillick had curated. And so once I knew I was going to start it, it wasn't casual. Like I worked with an animation studio and we had a specific budget, and everything was charted out really, every 30 seconds or so before we even made it. So there were points where I could improvise, like this still I could mess around with for a while, and aspects of the plates. But once I started it, it was really from a start to finish project. Yeah.
It's really interesting that you take the liberty to explore new territory with almost every film that you do, with almost every project that you start. And once I read that you look at each of those projects as an experience and as a learning process.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to learn about in this project was, so there's no dialogue. And so I kind of wanted to just learn in a basic sense about blocking and gesture, and just how choreography of a body can just say what you need it to say. I guess I felt like that was something I needed to learn 101 to keep exploring story, how to not rely on text or voiceover, or how to just keep it fully within the frame.
So let's move on to the third example, Enclosure, which is your most recent film, I think, that you accomplished in 2019. It's also the longest film you've ever done, I guess, 29 minutes, 42. It's, I would say, also probably the most ambitious production, because it's kind of a short movie, but a feature movie with actors, with costumes. I mean, it's, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's the story plays in the 17th century England, and I mean, I was really surprised to discover this work, and also to see how elaborated it is, and how much it alludes also to the history of cinema, and really is like a full-on movie with actors and with incredible actors, I must say, and it is really something that draws you in, that drew me in instantly, and that made me almost ask for more, you know. And I want to ask you first, like, will you go all the way? I mean, Steve McQueen is probably the only artist, contemporary artist, who made first a career as contemporary artist and then won an Oscar as best director with 12 Years a Slave. Would that be something that you would think of? And ultimately, will you do a feature movie?
I'm working with a collaborator, a writer right now on writing a script. So that's something I'm thinking about directly right now.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm excited about where the script's going, but yeah.
So if you come back to the story, I mean, how did you become interested in 17th century English history? Because, I mean, obviously there must be a connection to contemporary times. Otherwise you wouldn't just go back like for nostalgic reasons, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's similar to a minute ago, actually. I was thinking about what a destructive relationship we have to landscape. And so, yeah, strangely, there's this 500-year period in England, of which the Enclosure movement technically is this whole swath, but really in 17th century, in which land that had previously been basically common, like sort of unclaimed, left, was in a more feudal serf system that existed in the landscape, started to get carved up and sold to this emerging upper middle class of doctors and lawyers that came with the Enlightenment, who wanted to have a country house or a side business, or and so this new social stratification, like taking over the landscape, contributed to its destruction, and then became a model for how Western civilization has largely occupied landscape. And so I was interested in the connection between this mass deforestation that happened there during this time. It's kind of like cutting up of things, and a shift in people's perspective towards one another, and specifically ideas of magic that were so central to people's perspective on one another and the landscape shifting. So this moment in time for me was sort of the beginning. It's also when cash was invented, the kind of cash that we use now. There's a shot in the film showing that. So this moment in this place was like super ripe for looking at the effects of modern capitalism. And you know, one other thing is that this is the moment in which America, this kind of new world, ideas of utopia, is being colonized. And the characters in this film, especially the main character, is an example of the kinds of people that were coming to America. The main character, or technically the influence character, his goal is to eventually come to America and start a new life. And he's like a hustler, and he's kind of a bad guy, a snake oil kind of guy, and who were the founders of America. So it was also a way to look at the beginning of America for me.
So it's almost like a proto-history of capitalistic culture, or the beginnings of capitalistic culture.
Mm.
Can you tell us more about, there's this orb that we see now in this still image that it has a pertinent presence in the film. I mean, it's in the beginning scene, we have this orb. Can you reveal more about like the symbol that you created and its presence?
I don't have too much to say about it, actually, but I can say that at the time and in the place, this idea of the great chain of being, this connection between all things, and all things basically existing on a ladder, from the sky down to dirt, including angels and bugs and anything in between, was like really central to people's worldview. And so one of the things I was trying to do is that oftentimes the footage, the landscape feels not mundane, like kind of like everyday, nothing spectacular, nothing sublime really going in the landscape. Oh, here's like the forest or a field, just basic. And I wanted the sky to be kind of like a projection of how they might have seen the sky. So most of the skies you see are fake skies. We've replaced them to look the way they look. And so, yeah, this is a component of that, this kind of eclipse thing.
So let's watch a short excerpt from the film.
What are we looking at? You see, the nobles have begun clearing the woods, and this brings out bears who need to eat. And one female bear became obsessed with killing me. One day, when I saw her scratching at a tree, I fired a poison arrow at her heart, but she didn't go down. Sheltered beneath her was a cub, dead, blackened in ash from some hellish fire. A man-made flame, no doubt, and she carried that burnt corpse around with her everywhere. How is it, did you think, I lost my home and child?
Can you contextualize just a little bit this scene?
Sure. Okay, I'll zoom out to contextualize. The redheaded woman, the main character, is part of this group of grifters who are going to hustle this house into giving over their land deeds so that eventually her leader, this guy named Jacko, can take all the deeds and exchange them and go to America. So she is stationed outside this house. It's the house of a widow and her daughter, observing them to try to figure out what they're like so they know how, when they approach the house, to hustle them. And as she's doing that, this random woman called in the script the Stranger pops out of the woods and tells this sort of her horror story. And that's what it is.
I think it makes one really curious to see the whole movie. It's always a little bit a problem that art films have to be seen in a museum or a gallery, and that there are, I mean, to my knowledge, no streaming platforms where actually artists could directly also show their work, or like even for research matters. But I think our time is running out, and we promised to take some Q&A. Let's look up what we have. We have one question. How did success come to you so young? And do you feel like that it has affected your work or life in any way?
I went to graduate school, I guess I graduated when I was 25, I think. And we had the thesis show for Columbia. And two things I was really fortunate to have happened at that time. Josh Klein, the artist, saw my first work, which is a film called Sitting, Feeding, Sleeping, and he included it in a screening he was doing at EAI right after my thesis show at Columbia. And then someone else saw that Laura McLean Ferris was there at that screening, and she included it in a group show. And from there, I started to get included in other shows and so forth. So I was really lucky that Josh wanted to include Sitting, Feeding, Sleeping in his screening because it changed my life. And I would say that since then, all the works I've made have been commissioned or structured by an exhibition. So the next work I made, the second work, was Palisades and Palisades, which was for Sculpture Centers in Practice that I applied for. So since then, I would say each exhibition and showing opportunity has been a way to expand and deepen and learn more. I try to think of each project as school, taking myself to school.
Thank you. Next question. It seems like a lot of your work comes from your personal experiences or ideas about the world. How or when do you decide to turn those ideas or experiences into artworks?
Usually it's like a very basic thing. Like I mentioned, Lake Valley started because I felt guilty about leaving my dog at home. Or, I mean, a minute ago was obviously a much bigger experience, Hurricane Sandy, but usually a work starts from just a very everyday, almost like bland or subtle feeling that I have. And then wanting to open it up outside of myself and see what's really there and what it could be connected to.
Thank you. The next question from Richard Charter. When you were growing up on a farm in the country, did you have an imaginary human friend at any time?
No.
Next question. What excites you, inspires you now in these strange times? Movies, TV, personal life. I mean, you answered that partly at least, but maybe you have something to add.
Something to add. I've been watching a lot of Japanese ghost stories. Also, I had a baby 4 weeks ago, so my brain is kind of like lives on the internet and Reddit and is not doing much right now, I would say. So yeah, I don't know, but I'm inspired about the script I'm working on, which I am working on right now, and watching as much as I can. Okay,
thank you. The next question. what does your creative process look like as of late? Has it changed with the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been working on actually during the pandemic are these etching, engraving drawings that are related to Enclosure. And I've had the opportunity to work with this kind of master engraver. So it's been really cool because it's been human contact thing that I could work on during the pandemic. But otherwise, I've been working on this script, which is really no different than how I would work normally, other than that the person I'm working with, she and I have never met in person because we started during COVID. And so we've only ever met over Zoom. And it's so strange how intimate that actually can be over time, this way.
Thank you. The next one, since you were trained as a painter before entering grad school at Columbia, would you mind sharing how you learned film video making? Are there film works that are particularly influential?
Yes. When I was in grad school after my first semester, and I felt like I didn't want to be an artist and I wanted to become a filmmaker. And yes, I learned there at Columbia, there's a place called the DMC, which is, I think it's called the Digital Media Center. It's a room with a bunch of computers where people go to hang out and eat lunch, basically. But one of the things that Columbia offers is they had Ronnie Bass at the time. I don't know if it's still Ronnie, who's an artist and a friend, was there to teach digital media for certain, like almost like office hours. So from like 10 to 12, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so I would go in and kind of stalked Ronnie, and Ronnie taught me how to edit, how to literally use the program. And then I use this online website called Lynda. I think it still exists, where you can get tutorials for different programs. So that's basically how I've always learned, is either with a friend or teaching myself online. And I never took a film class or a how to do any of this class. And I think that for me, that was important to feel like it was mine. And like I was learning the rules that I wanted to learn, something like that. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question. Hi, Rachel. Do you conceptually distinguish video works created in the museum art context versus those created for web streaming? Where do you think we are headed in terms of media art and its audience?
Well, for each of my works, I kind of briefly mentioned it before, but I think through how it's going to be installed. And I think of each of the works having a kind of set of conditions that live with it, that bring out different aspects of it, like Everything and More being shown on a semi-transparent scrim with natural light against a window. That's related to how the film is itself edited. Where are we going with digital media streaming? I have no idea. One thing I hope maybe from COVID that we can take away is how much time I think that might have hopefully slowed down art production and slowed down people's working models. And so where we're going, I hope that people can spend time doing their work, but I don't know. I mean.
Thank you. Next one. In the version of Lake Valley I saw, the edits seem to be morphing or glitching quickly between shots rather than hard cuts. Was that deliberate or just a file compression error? Smile. As a video artist animator, I found it really unsettling and interesting.
Yeah, intentional. This kind of phantasmagoria way to move through space. Yeah, I mean, just like because I care a lot about editing, I'm always thinking about what a cut means and literally if you're cutting or not, and how fast you're cutting. And so, yes, when it morphs, it's supposed to morph.
Thank you. The last question, beyond the obvious role in Lake Valley, but also considering the rotoscoped Philip Johnson and the Midsummer Night's Dream sequences in Will-O-Wisp, how would you characterize your connection to animation as a filmmaker?
It's like such an expansive question because in a really basic sense, I'm drawn to fables and myths. And so much of animation that I grew up with in Disney are direct illustrations of myth. So that's one relationship. Another would be this thing about maybe relating to like painting and drawing and the hand, and wanting to have my hand and my touch in what I'm doing. So maybe those are two primary ways I relate to animation.
Can you imagine to pick up painting again at some point in your career, or is that something that is set once and for good?
I don't know. I have such respect for painters that are able to channel their interests and who they are through the medium. I found it so hard. I felt so depressed and alone against myself, and like I just had no idea how to use the materials basically to say something. So I think if I could do that, absolutely. But
it's interesting if you think of Sonia Kantorovsky, who actually did an animated movie after painting for many years, but somehow like in the sensibility and in the wit of his figures and the gestures, the movements, I see a certain relationship between your works, like even between your films and his paintings.
You know, I don't know enough about what he's thinking about when he makes his paintings, but that animated film I loved that he made. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Rachel, thank you so much for your time and dedication and for all the interesting insights we got into your work.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. I also want to thank Sarah and Claire for the assistance with the interpretation and captioning this evening, and Amy Bauer for organizing and managing all these talks. And finally, a big thank you to all of you for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday for the next Talking to Our Time Artist Talk with Paul Pfeiffer, joined by Hirshhorn Associate Curator Marina Isgro. Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you so much.